All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Greg Batchelor, and I'm representing the MIT Sloan Office of External Relations. It's good to be with you today. MIT Sloan Alumni Online brings you conversations with principled, innovative leaders who improve the world and embody the mission of the MIT Sloan School of Management. I'm happy to kick things off with our speakers. Jacqueline Selby will be moderating our conversation today, featuring Grace Ueng, leadership coach and CEO of Savvy Growth. She is also the author of a weekly column on our topic today, which is leadership and happiness. We'll be touching on mental health, vulnerability, and workplace relationships, and this is such an important topic for all of us. So first, thank you to our audience. Thank you to our speakers for taking the time out of your day to pause and reflect and dive into this together as a community. So Jackie has prepared some questions for Grace to get us started, and we'll hold time to get to our audience-submitted questions towards the end of the session today. You can use the chat or the Q&A feature in your Zoom interface. Please feel free to update your Zoom name to include your program and class year. Jackie and Grace, thank you so much for your time today. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to the External Relations Office for your partnership on this ongoing series. And I will echo Greg's sentiments. We appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to join us. It really is a privilege to welcome Grace Ueng today to share both her personal experiences as well as professional expertise on the topics of positive psychology, leadership, and happiness. As Grace has noted in her coaching, happiness is the key to success, not the other way around. And successful leaders learn to nurture both happiness in themselves as well as others. So Grace, thank you very much for being here with us today to share your insights on this important topic. Before we begin, though, would love to just invite you to share a bit more about your background and personal experiences that will inform our discussion today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie and Greg and MIT. And I'm grateful to see so many of you here today joining us and look forward to answering your questions as well. I'm delighted to spend a few minutes to start this session sharing my story about how I became interested in studying positive psychology and happiness. It all started 8 years ago, and the trigger was my only child was leaving home to go to college. And as a single mom, my son was a big focus of my life. And I was fearful of falling into despondency and becoming an empty nester, given my genetic predisposition for depression. So I proactively began my own happiness journey and started listening to Gretchen Rubin's The Happiness Project on a spring break road trip with my son his senior year in high school. And I immediately latched on to this field of study. It was just what I needed during this transitional point in my life. And then I quickly discovered a positive psychology course taught at Harvard. It was taught 17 years ago by Tal Ben-Shahar, and a record number of students took this course. And it made sense, as 80% of students at Harvard at that time reported having a mental health challenge. And everyone wants to be happier. And so I ravenously watched all 22 lectures. And initially, I took these studies for purely personal reasons, but I soon learned that these studies could benefit my coaching clients. And then I discovered Tal's Whole Being Institute and earned my certificate in positive psychology coaching. And during that year-long study of positive psychology, I created a body of content for my speaking and writing that I entitled Project Peak, Climbing the Mountains of Life, Business, and Beyond, and came up with a 7-theme framework that became the foundation of my coaching that individuals could apply to their lives. It was a natural step after my TED Talk the prior year, which focused on obstacles in entrepreneurship and correlated climbing the 7 summits, the tallest summits on each of our continents, to starting a company, and 10 steps to reach the top in both of those endeavors. And then fast forward several years, after losing my father and then my mother, and then experiencing some personal and professional losses, and then right afterwards, moving out of my home of 25 years, I went through all this in a very short amount of time. I went through what is called compounded grief and ended up falling into a very challenging depressive episode myself, the darkest place that I'd ever been. Now, when I was in that dark tunnel, I summoned up the energy to log into my Harvard Business School 30th reunion, because I never had missed a reunion. And I logged in just in time to hear Lynn Schlesinger, who was one of my professors decades earlier, introduce Arthur Brooks, whose book, From Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Your Life, would soon be available. His content reminded me of my studies with Tal Ben-Shahar years earlier and gave me a glimmer of hope. And I thought, if I ever emerge from this dark place, that I would renew my happiness studies. Thankfully, I came out of that dark place and decided to renew my work in happiness. And I enrolled in a year-long program studying again with Tal Ben-Shahar, who had since started Happiness Studies Academy with fellow journeyers throughout the world. And if anyone on the session today would be interested in these studies, feel free to connect with me, and I'll be happy to share some more information. And last fall, I had the chance to spend a few days in Acapulco, Mexico with Tal and fellow journeyers to study with them. And Acapulco is a place where positive psychology was founded by Marty Seligman and Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, the father of flow, 25 years ago. At that time, Marty counted up the number of research studies that were done on human maladies and compared them to the number that were conducted on human flourishing. In the prior 30-year period, depression had increased tenfold, and the mean age of depression had been cut in half from around age 30 to around the age that a student enters high school. He thought about this ratio that was 21-1 of human maladies to human flourishing, and he thought that it was high time to flip that ratio and instead focus on the study of what makes human beings flourish. So Project Peak and positive psychology have formed the foundation of my coaching work. And then at the start of last year, an editor reached out and asked if I was interested in writing a weekly column for his publication. And I was newly in remission and I love to write, so I immediately said yes. And then I would need a few weeks to think about what the theme would be for my column. I reached out to Arthur Brooks and asked him for an advanced copy of his new book, the book that I mentioned earlier, to review for my new column. And just as Tal had taught the very popular course at Harvard, Arthur was starting to teach this course at Harvard Business School, and he called it Leadership and Happiness. So I decided to theme my column Happiness and Leadership and launched on Valentine's Day last year. And I said that it would be the greatest Valentine's gift to me if someone in my readership would be benefited by my coming out about my depression. So just as my columns are being published, I began to be called into helping companies and organizations deal with their mental health challenges. And I created a body of work that I entitled Happiness Works. The science of positive psychology works, but it takes ongoing work. Happiness matters in business, and happiness drives business results. Happy employees stay 4 times longer in their jobs. They commit 2 times more time to tasks, and they have 65% more energy. So it's been my privilege and joy to be able to help companies in this way. And by teaching happiness, I work on my own happiness, and it's a virtuous cycle.
Well, thank you, Grace, and thank you for sharing your very personal journey with us. We appreciate that very much. So now we'll move into the moderated questions, and the theme for these is the overall focus of your coaching as well as your column, which basically organizes positive psychology and happiness into a few core pillars. So we'll take each of those one by one. So let's start with happiness overall. Your weekly column, as you referenced, Happiness and Leadership. Could you share your perspective on why happiness leads to success and not the other way around?
Sure. Conventional wisdom tells us that achievement is important in order to be happy. For instance, just when we achieve X or Y or Z, such as getting into the college of your choice, getting to the MBA program of your choice, or getting promoted to vice president, then you'll finally be happy. I know for me, when I was in high school, a big part of my focus was getting good grades and doing what I needed to do to get into a good college. And then that would make me successful and happy. And then my senior year at MIT, a big focus of mine was getting into a top MBA program. And I clearly remember that my senior year at MIT, when I got the letter from Harvard Business School that I had received deferred admission, that I would be admitted after working for 2 years, that I was jumping up and down for joy, running around my dorm floor, trying to see if anyone was at home so I could share this great news, because I thought my life was set and that this accomplishment would make me have a happy life forever. And of course, that feeling was quite temporary. And in that 1-year study of positive psychology, there were 2 studies that really stuck out at me. One was conducted by Daniel Gilbert, a professor of psychology at Harvard, and it was on tenure. And he reached out and researched professors who were up for tenure. And the results at that time were quite surprising. He found out that there was just a temporary uptick in happiness. Those people who earned tenure returned after a short while to their set point. And then the second research that had an impact on me was with lottery winners. So often we say, oh, well, I could do that if I just won the lottery. Well, similar findings were found in that research, that there was not statistically significant increase in happiness after winning the lottery. And then I went on to read the book that was written by Sean Acor, who's was a teaching fellow for Tal Ben-Shahar. And he conducted extensive research on happiness, and he found out that happiness is what fuels success, not the other way around. When we are positive, our brains become more engaged, creative, motivated, energetic, and resilient, and productive at work. And then I learned in Arthur Brooks' book about the hedonic treadmill, that no matter how hard we work to achieve great things, there's always somebody else doing something and we could do better. And at MIT and HBS, I could always find someone doing something better. And then when I went to Bain and then Fortune 500 companies, General Mills and Clorox, I found the same thing. The happiness advantage, what Jackie just mentioned earlier, is also the core of Arthur Brooks' course. And now professors Robert Posen and Susan Neal, they're teaching happiness in the MBA program at Sloan. And I'm really happy to hear that. And their course is based on the work that Brooks did. And I think that it's great that so many universities are teaching happiness.
Absolutely. No, it's a wonderful development. Thank you, Grace. In addition to happiness, confidence is another key pillar and focus of your discussions and research. So you've shared that many leaders do not have the confidence that one might expect. And yet research shows that higher self-confidence and self-esteem are predictors of a higher level of happiness, and in turn, increased happiness improves confidence. So could you please share your thoughts on this virtuous cycle?
Sure. I remember about 25 years ago when I was about to go into my first vice president of marketing role, and it was in an area new for me. It was business to business enterprise software, and I'd only done consumer marketing prior to that. The CEO who hired me, he said, "Don't worry, Grace." His former marketing leader, Jane, would show me the ropes and answer all of my questions. And Jane indeed ended up being an invaluable resource, and we became good friends. And it was interesting to me that she later told me that when she first met me, she was surprised that I didn't have more confidence. I thought about it, and I had just become suddenly single with a 14-month-old baby when we met, and I was in a brand new executive role for me on a white all-male leadership team. My confidence wasn't where it should have been or needed to be, but I was intrinsically motivated to figure it all out, as I knew that I was on my own. I really needed to do well. So decades later, many leaders who come to me for coaching, they ask me to help them with their confidence. And if you look at statistics, confidence is a bigger issue with women, and it's in much shorter supply with women. Over the years, I've had the chance to meet some members of the UNC women's soccer team. They've won 21 of the last 40 national women's soccer championships. And I learned of a couple of books that their coach has them read. And one of them is this book, The Confidence Code, by Katie Kay and Claire Shipman. And I wrote a column with my key takeaways. And a lot of, as I speak, I might mention certain columns that I've written, and I'll make sure that you guys get links to these columns. But I'll share a few things that I learned from this book now. The first is that self-efficacy, or believing in yourself, is the core to confidence. 2, that confidence is more important than competence and success. Number 3, don't worry so much about pleasing other people, and in turn, learn to accept constructive feedback gracefully. One of my earliest clients who went on to great success, she told me when she first hired me, I seek truth, not comfort. And another CEO who's also very successful would tell his employees often, feedback is a gift for which you say thank you. Also, the book talks about how perfection is not necessarily a good thing. And I've seen this time and time again in my coaching and in my own life. Nor is ruminating and over-preparing what women often do. So remember this virtuous cycle. Believing in yourself is a core to confidence and also to happiness. Research shows that if you say to yourself, I know I can do X, Y, or Z, the likelihood is the attainment is higher. When you believe in yourself, you, in essence, will the outcome to happen. And that same CEO that I mentioned earlier, he would say to people later, I could always count on Grace to will the right outcomes to happen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grace. And certainly, so building upon confidence is vulnerability. And you've definitely spoken about the importance of vulnerability, trust, as well as empathy in forming close relationships, both personally and professionally. So could you share your thoughts on how this relates to leadership?
Sure. One of the 7 themes of my Project Peak that I mentioned earlier is failure and how it's a good thing. And in recent years, I've been asked to give entire talks on failure. I can fill a whole hour on my failure. And this was not always an easy topic for me. For years, I didn't feel comfortable talking about my failures. It wasn't easy talking about being fired or getting really difficult feedback. Earlier in my career, I thought I always had to be buttoned up. And I've learned more recently that vulnerability is a strength, and opening up and sharing openly is an attractive trait. And it allows others, it encourages others to open up also and move towards you, and for them to feel safe. Last year, a coaching client told me that I always give people the benefit of the doubt. And it was said in a way that I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or it was constructive feedback or it was just an observation. A few months later, in reading the book, The $1 Trillion Coach, and then The Fearless Organization, I gained more insight into this comment. And I'll share more information. I'll forward some links that I've written about these 2 books. One is Bill Campbell, and he was a legendary coach who mentored top Silicon Valley leaders, including Sheryl Sandberg, and Stephen Jobs. And he was famous for building what the writers of this book, his coachees, they posthumously wrote this book to commemorate all the things that they had learned from him. They said that he was really good at developing an envelope of trust, that trust was Bill's superpower. And this was important because trust is the most important currency in any relationship, personal or professional. And that's like I realized that that's like my giving people the benefit of the doubt. I trust them. And the people who wrote this book about Bill, they said that there was 3 ways that Bill demonstrated trust so well. One is that he was always loyal. He was one of the only Apple executives to fight for Steve Jobs when he was fired back in 1985. And this was the basis of why Steve had such a deep friendship with Bill and formed the basis of their coaching relationship too. The second thing was integrity and ability. Bill was always honest and he expected the same in return. And he always expected you to have the talent, skills, power, and diligence to accomplish what you promised. And finally, the third and really important point is he had discretion. Bill would always keep his promise of confidentiality, and he would always bring up performance issues only in private and not embarrass anyone publicly. He would only coach those who are coachable, those who are humble and lifelong learners. It doesn't work to coach someone who doesn't want to be coached or doesn't think they need to be coached. It had to be the coachee's decision, and that's when a coaching relationship really works. And one leader who was at Google and coached by Bill, he said something that really stood out to me, and I wanted to share it with you. He said, a coach is someone who tells you what you don't want to hear, who has you see what you don't want to see, so you can be who you have always known you could be. The second book that I mentioned earlier is The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. And at my last Harvard Business School reunion, I had the chance to be in her classroom. And she's best known for her work in psychological safety. And her research was leveraged at Google within their extensive study called Project Aristotle. And that was a quest that Google had to figure out what makes the most successful teams. Why did some stumble and why did some soar? So they gathered their best statisticians, their organizational psychologists, and programmers, engineers to lead the study. And they poured over a half a century of academic journals, as well as data on 180 teams. From all this research, they observed that it was really quite simple, that there were two behaviors that all good teams generally shared. One was equality in distribution of conversational turn-taking. And number two, there was high average social sensitivity. So with the first, everyone had roughly the same amount of airtime. As long as everyone got a chance to speak, the team did well. But if only one person or a small group of people dominated the conversation, the collective intelligence declined. And I'll share with you a post that I wrote about my first year at Harvard Business School, where I had quite a Sharky section and why it was difficult for me to do my best in that situation. And I had this aha when I learned about the Project Aristotle, because I think this is what happened with our section. So the number one trait is that these groups were skilled at intuiting how others felt based on the tone of their voice, their expression, and other nonverbal cues. And they would know when someone was feeling upset or left out. They had strong social intelligence. And in life, at work, in order to be happy, we all want to be seen and we want to be heard. And when both happen, this leads to the best performance. And it really struck out to me what Amy said in her book. When you give someone the benefit of the doubt, that is when they trust you. When you're in a psychologically safe environment, others give you the benefit of the doubt. And you also must be in the room. Ray Dalio, who is a founder of the world's largest Fed fund, Bridgewater Associates, and he wrote this book, Principles, which I also do recommend. He was known for his radical gospel of radical transparency. He had a unique culture where he said that if you're going to speak about anyone else, they also had to be in the room. And those who talked about colleagues behind their backs, they were referred to as slimy weasels. And finally, I encourage you all to say thanks. When someone has the courage to say something that's difficult, it's natural for us to get defensive. I know that that's my natural tendency. Instead of immediately refuting or being defensive, pause, take a deep breath and say, thank you. And I encourage you all to try this. And I'll also include in the follow-up links more in-depth research and information on these topics that I just discussed.
Well, thank you, Grace. There's some wonderful insights that you shared with us. We appreciate it. And building upon that, the idea of being vulnerable and being able to absorb feedback gracefully is self-awareness. And certainly you've talked about the fact that leaders must understand their own blind spots in order to improve as leaders. So could you share a bit more about this concept?
Yeah, an MIT professor, a thought leader in leadership, Warren Bennis, he said a quote that's really stuck out at me. And it's quite simple. And the quote is, "Knowing thyself is the essence of leadership." He earned his PhD from MIT, and he was the chair of your organizational studies department. And it's interesting that when you look at some leaders, when you work at a company and you look at the CEO, it's really interesting how sometimes there's certain things that people think about us or the CEO, and everyone knows except for that person, the CEO, for instance. It's more comfortable for us to keep our blind spots blind than have them revealed to us. And constructive feedback, as I said, is really hard to receive. I asked in one of my columns for readers to answer one question. And that question was, would you like to know the one thing that if you changed about yourself, that you'd have the ability to change the world? It takes hard work, intentional and thoughtful work to reveal your blind spots. And we're all born with blind spots. And there's actually a technical term for blind spots. It's scotoma, and it's an obscuration of your visual field. And that's why cars are built with blind spot detectors. And they're getting better with time, these blind spot detectors. And we can also get better in discovering our blind spots through hard work. Blind spots can be also strengths that we don't realize, and therefore we're not fully harnessing. It's not necessarily just difficult things about ourselves. And Marianne Williamson once famously quoted that our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. So I thought that was quite a deep, deep quote. And some of the links that I'll share with you, you'll learn more about the neurology of your brain and how it operates and how you can outsmart your brain. I actually, in one of my columns, I shared 6 suggestions on how to outsmart your brain to make better decisions, and then 6 questions that you can ask yourself to discover your greatest strengths. And also how your amygdala and your frontal lobe, they actually help work together, either to help you have better decision-making to respond to stress, or they can help you flee from things that are really dangerous. And then I wanted to share also the power of 360s. 85% of Fortune 500 companies utilize 360s because they can be very powerful. And when I start a coaching engagement for a client, I must always conduct a 360. And then I kick off the engagement by conducting this 360 and then sharing my synthesized findings. And the power of these findings can be transformative. Right now, I'm coaching the dean of a business school, and she just received her 360. And she was named as dean at quite a young age, much earlier than most people. And her provost and her chancellor see her high potential and that she's going to be next in line for their spots. And when I shared the 360 with her, I've been so impressed how she's immediately taken hold of the strengths that people say about her and is starting to build upon her strengths even in a stronger way. And then the areas that she could fill gaps, she's immediately taking hold. And I'm just so proud of seeing her take in the 360 and take action.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful tool to gain certainly significant insight. So thank you for sharing, Grace. So throughout the discussion so far today, we've talked a lot about coaching, collaboration, and working to kind of learn your blind spots and improve. And so a natural building point from there is goal setting. And you've talked about the importance of goal setting for yourself and not for others. So could you share more about this approach and kind of why it's different and why it's so important?
Sure, sure. In order to achieve lasting success, it's important that your goals are intrinsically motivated, not extrinsically motivated. I'll share a little bit about planning and setting goals that I learned early on with Fortune 500 companies, and then I applied it to the technology startups I worked for. For instance, at General Mills and at Clorox, we did a quite simple planning, although it took several weeks, planning process. We would review the last year, pour over tons of data to understand and analyze the past year's performance. And from that, we would think through what are the 3 top key issues that we should focus on in the coming year. And then we set big goals, 3 big goals, and then we wrote a plan to get there. And the way your brain is organized, high goals are the best. And then don't set specific goals for other people, just set them for yourself, and overall high-level goals for the team. Your brain does the rest. It's been scientifically proven that your brain restructures its brain cells so in order to be more successful, and your brain works better when you know that you're passionate about achieving a goal. And that's the amygdala, the frontal lobe, and the concept of neuroplasticity that makes this all happen. Just like I said earlier, when I was named the vice president of marketing for that enterprise B2B software company, I was very self-motivated. I was very passionate as a newly single mom to achieve. If you really desire a goal, you reduce the evaluation of the difficulty of achieving that goal. That's the way your brain thinks. Your brain perceives obstacles as less significant when you are highly emotionally attached to a goal. That's why it has to be your own goal, not one that your parent sets for you. For instance, last night I got a text from an old friend of mine, and he sent a link to a company that was actually founded by MIT alums. And he asked, is there a way that you can connect his daughter, who's a senior in college, to this company? And I wrote back, because I know from the studies that it's his daughter that needs to want to work at this company, not the father. So I simply texted back, have her contact me with what she would like. And also, one thing that I've written quite a bit about is the correlation between music and happiness. And I write about how I recently restarted my piano studies after a 4-decade hiatus. And I've done this largely to honor the memory of my mom, who was my first teacher. And it's been amazing and how my piano has progressed. I've only been taking lessons for just about half a year, but because now I'm intrinsically motivated versus when I was a little girl taking piano, when I was extrinsically motivated, my passion for piano is much, much higher, and my progress is much stronger. Each lesson, I just soak in and ask so many questions. And there's just such a big difference between being intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. And now I know through studying how your brain works and the neurological components of it, that your brain is structured to work very hard on your behalf if you are intrinsically motivated, if it's your own goal, not your boss's goal, and not your parents' goal. So a leader should set ambitious, challenging goals for themselves, and then think through how they should inspire others to do the same. So at my startups, I fervently desired the goals that I set out for myself. And in turn, my teams who saw my passion, they were inspired to set their own lofty goals. And I know now that we are simply organizing our brains to work their best with these crazy ambitious goals that we set for ourselves.
Thank you, Grace. Those are wonderful reminders and certainly very important to keep us on target, on task. So thank you for sharing. So now we will move into some of the pre-submitted questions that we've received, but we also encourage you, we have time to take additional questions from the audience. So please don't be shy and feel free to type them in the chat or in the Q&A session, and we will get to as many questions as we can with the time remaining. So Grace, the first pre-submitted question that we received is, why are leaders afraid to speak about happiness at work? Could you please share your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this question. It really made me think. And so I wrote a whole column about it, which I'll share with you. So there's a lot of fear around and stigma around mental health, mental illness. So many who have, and many means there's a lot of people out there who have, as I mentioned, like for instance, the Harvard situation where 80% said that they were going through some kind of mental hardship in the prior year. But still, even with these large statistics, many remain fearful of sharing with their bosses, and therefore the bosses are afraid of talking about it. So many people think that it will hurt their reputation at work. They think that it might make people look at them differently when or if they're found out. We also should keep in mind that another reason why people are maybe fearful of it, depending on the age of the leader, this is a really new field of study. Positive psychology is only 25 years old. And to put that in perspective, it didn't exist when I was in college. And I would think that it may or may not have existed depending on the age of the people. People who are maybe 10 years out of school, they might have started hearing about it. And so yeah, it was just 25 years ago that Marty Seligman and Meg High, Csikszentmihalyi came together to start this field. And happiness is often a misunderstood construct. Some people think happiness is just this touchy-feely emotion. And actually, it's based on a lot of science. Positive psychology is, and happiness is part of positive psychology. And so some people who misunderstand it, they may, even worse, they may make fun of it. They don't understand, they don't know the statistics. Because if they did know the statistics, they would embrace this. And just a couple of facts. The American Psychological Association, in their study last year on work and well-being, they found that 81% of individuals say that when they look for their next job, they're going to look for one where mental health is supported. That's a vast, vast majority. And then a 2022 Harris poll reported that 94%, almost all US workers, experience chronic stress at work. So it's no wonder that companies now are offering subscriptions to online therapy sites such as Talkspace, the meditation app Headspace, and HR leaders are saying that their next step is to offer on-site counseling with therapists or coaches to help with personal or professional issues. And this perhaps could help contribute to the bigger goal of diminishing the stigma surrounding mental illness. It could be that coming out to your team about mental health challenges could create more collaboration at work. A clinical psychologist who served as an on-site therapist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, she observed an interesting phenomena. She said that she noticed that whenever she went out to get clients in the waiting room who knew the other people in the waiting room, that there was a greater sense of camaraderie versus shame. People, once they opened up, they felt like they had instant friends. I know for myself that when I've shared my personal story in the last year, I've been touched by the large number of people who, former colleagues, friends, people I've never met, and actually a lot of people I've never met who've reached out to me. And often it's one-on-one versus saying it in a public chat string, but they've expressed gratitude to me for my coming out because it's helped them normalize their own situation or situation they're facing in their household or in their close friend circle.
Absolutely. Thank you. Certainly, it helps to talk with others and to build trust, of course. So the other pre-submitted question that we'd like to discuss is, as it relates to happiness, do you see a difference between founders and those in corporate leadership?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so founders create the vision and mission, and hired leaders usually have to buy into them. Founders are, just by definition, they're more emotional and attached because the company is their baby. Founders may focus more on the journey. I remember years ago, about 20 years ago, when I first started my business, one of my first clients, a founder, said to me, "Now, Grace, I want to do this until I die. So I don't want you doing in this fast money stuff that you do with a lot of your clients." And I promised him that I wouldn't do that, but it was interesting. A few years later, we did work with him on a successful exit. But after an exit, founders are often serial because they do seek to repeat the journey. The final theme of the 7 themes of my Project Peak is enjoying the journey. And that founder who I mentioned, this past client, he is working on his next, right after, as soon as his non-compete ended, he did start his next company. And so happiness is not focusing on the exit or reaching the top of the summit, it's enjoying the journey. Oftentimes hired staff or the investors, the venture capitalists, they will focus maybe more on the exit. But the exit can't be your vision or mission. My partner and I were brought in to a client a number of years ago, and we found it really interesting in the first session that we were facilitating for them to get toward, we were doing a strategic review for them, and we wanted to really understand what their mission and vision was. And we found it interesting that they said, oh, our vision, our mission is to sell this company. And that really can't be what your vision mission is. It needs to be something bigger. It's something that you can build a strong foundation for your company, something that your team, your customers can all be inspired by. So in the end, what you talked about earlier, you're asking about that, the happiness advantage, that it's happiness that creates success, not the other way around. That applies to everyone, founders or leaders. But there are differences in founders, as I mentioned, and enjoy the journey, and then how you focus on the exit. I think that is a difference between the two.
I think that's wonderful advice, to enjoy the journey for all of us. So absolutely. So one of the questions we've received live today is, could you share a little bit about just your opinion on which leaders or organizations are doing this particularly well, prioritizing happiness most effectively?
Yeah. I think based on the work that's being done at a lot of large companies, they know that it has to be addressed. So companies like Google, for instance, they did the Project Aristotle. They poured a lot of time into doing that research. They have talks there where authors of a lot of the books that I mentioned, they go and do talks there. They have meditation. Meditation is a cool thing. It's something that they have meditation rooms. So a lot of companies, like in the Silicon Valley, they probably were the early adopters for these, have embraced it, and have the meditation rooms. They've, like I was mentioning, on-site therapy. They have happiness book clubs. They embrace it. They know that there's this happiness advantage. For instance, Sean Acor has done consulting. Tal Ben-Shahar, he's my main teacher, Arthur Brooks. They've all done consulting for all the large companies, I would say, especially the tech companies. They know how important it is. I would say the enlightened companies know how important it is. The ones who've been reading these books and on our cutting edge about mental health, and knowing how important it is for their staff, their teams to be flourishing. And I think that it's harder perhaps for earlier stage companies to have the time, to have the budgets for this type, but I think some things can be done without even having a budget, some things such as having a book club around it, but it's finding the time and space for it and realizing that carving out that time and space will pay back and have ROI in spades.
Absolutely. Thank you. So one of the other questions that we've received is certainly whether you're a leader of a startup company or a large corporation, you'll have to deal with hardship at some point and in difficult situations. So could you speak about how leaders can incorporate happiness or the habit of being happiness into those stressful situations?
When something is happening, that a crisis happens? Yeah. So some of the things that, well, first, I think it's important to have ongoing things so that when you have a crisis, like if you have a practice of meditation, then you'll automatically know to do the deep breathing, to pause, and to think through, and to do listening. But if you don't, then things that you can immediately start doing are stopping, like what I mentioned earlier, versus immediately being defensive and immediately speaking yourself, it's important to step back and listen, to do the listening tour. Oftentimes when someone starts a new job, a new CEO or new leadership role, they do a listening tour where they go and listen to all their key sites and hear what people are saying. The same thing happens there, is to really understand and listen to the key stakeholders, to kind of dissect what maybe went wrong and make sure that everyone is seen and heard. So there's that psychological safety, and then to have evenness, to hear all voices, not to have one group speaking louder and out of turn, because that could be what created the problem to begin with. Amy Edmondson talks about her work in healthcare, for instance, where there's been situations where someone was courageous enough because they had a psychologically safe environment to question something that a surgeon forgot to do. And if they hadn't, then it could have ended up ending the life of somebody, because maybe there was I believe there was a safety check that was skipped, and someone at a lower level brought it up, and therefore they corrected it. So sometimes a crisis could happen because we're all so busy, we're all moving so fast that some safety check perhaps was overlooked. And I think when you're doing that, stepping back and doing the due diligence to understand why something happened, there really needs to be that psychological safety for people, especially if it's some maybe an entry-level person who sees somebody many layers above them, they didn't do something that if perhaps they did, then the crisis would not have happened. So I would say listening, creating safety for people in order to understand what happened. And then of course, have a plan in place to avoid that in the future.
That's very good advice. And actually building upon that question, I think this is a great next one. And thinking about the importance of listening and psychological safety, could you share your thoughts on the best way to bring up unhappiness or lack of happiness to management?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if there is that open environment where people are able to use their voice, then there will be some channel in which people can mention this. Oftentimes leaders think that everything is all hunky-dory because people do bring things to them, but they're the positive things because people want to show their best, put their best foot forward to their boss, to their CEO. And so they hear about these things. They may also hear about some issues that may not be quite the deep, dark, scary ones. They may hear about other issues and they work through them. The ones that are sort of the taboo subjects, if the leader anchors a conversation by bringing up something about themselves, then that can help the conversation. For instance, several weeks ago, I was asked to go to a startup tech company. One of the leaders asked me to go in to help facilitate a leadership team meeting where the company had gone through a lot of things in the last year, and they needed to all get on the same page. And I was going to go in and I had appreciative inquiry exercises all ready. And Tal Ben-Shahar had actually given me some advice going into that. And so I had a bunch of exercises ready to work through with the leadership team. But before I did that, I had an icebreaker exercise. And I asked them in opening up for me to get to know them and to get to know each other, more importantly, to say a couple things. One, something kind of fun or funny about themselves. And the second thing was something a little more serious about themselves that perhaps other people would know. And what I did was I anchored the conversation by sharing things about myself. And most people didn't know me in the group. Only a couple people in the group had known me before. And I shared things that were quite vulnerable. And that Tal told me later, I anchored the conversation, and it was quite amazing because two people in that group actually started crying because when they started sharing their stories, and people shared really deep things as a result of anchoring. So being vulnerable yourself, anchoring a conversation and saying and sharing something that's one of those deep, dark, scary things, that's when you will get other people to open up.
Agreed, absolutely. Now, we received a couple of questions about certainly the impacts of COVID, which of course all of us have felt. So could you share your thoughts a little bit on on how remote work possibly influences happiness? And if you have suggestions on how to keep remote employees happy and motivated, and building upon that, does happiness depend on interpersonal connectivity and interactions, or, and does remote work kind of jeopardize that?
Yeah. First of all, everyone is different. Everyone is different as far as how they interact with other people. And that's why oftentimes in coaching, I ask for coachees to submit to them all the different personality profiles that have been done on them. So I just want to caveat by first saying that I do think that nothing can replace in-person interaction. In-person interaction, there's a strength about it that I encourage all groups to have some form of in-person opportunity. I do think that hybrid has actually allowed people to maybe see each other more often because it's easier logistically to get on a Zoom. But I do think that it's very important if you're going to work with someone purely remotely, that you are able to meet them in person. You have at some point the ability to meet them in person, and then to build into the year times in which you all will get together in person to supplement the time that you meet through a hybrid setting. And then when you do meet in person, to really, really take advantage of that. For instance, one of the people I'm coaching, they've asked me to lead a retreat this fall for their team, 150 people. And there's opportunity for some of those people to communicate and collaborate more. And so I'm starting that retreat. I'm bringing in my improv teacher. And I have found through work that I've done in improv that improv just makes people be vulnerable. It makes people to think on their feet by the very nature of improv. And MBA programs now are teaching improv. It's quite a popular elective in second-year programs at many universities. And it's because improv helps in business. It helps in life and it helps in business because it makes you think on your feet. It makes you think of yes and versus yes but, and it helps people be more collaborative. So I think you can do improv by Zoom, but it's really powerful in person. So I think when you do meet in person, it's important to have those types of exercises where you can grow closer together so that when you're back on Zoom, you have shared that common experience.
I think that's wonderful advice. Thank you, Grace. So I think we probably have time for one final question, and I'd like to end today on some more of a personal question. So could you share, Grace, how you integrate techniques from the psychology of happiness into your daily schedule? What works most effectively for you, and maybe what hasn't?
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, I've started this Happiness Works, and I need to walk my own talk, because if I'm going to have other people do it, I want to share things that work well in my life. So what I've done off and on, but now in the last year, I do very strictly, is I end the day by journaling. And then in the end of my journal, I write down, I used to write 3, now I write 5 things that I'm grateful for. And they can be really, really small things. And then I write 5 things that I'm looking forward to doing, because there's research that shows that anticipation can build happiness. And so, for instance, I've written down a few times that I'm looking forward to meeting with all of you and sharing my story. So, and then after I do that, I meditate, and I have a lot of different sources of my meditation. What I listen to, Tal Ben-Shahar has supplied our fellow journeyers with many different options for meditation. I also have on my phone the Calm app, which has a 10 to 12 daily meditation that sometimes I use. I started, just to let you know, several years ago with my meditation because people told me I should do it, and I really fought it because it was really hard. And I downloaded the Insight timer, and I would just try 3 minutes, and it was painful. But now I really, really look forward to a 10 to 15 to 20 minutes of meditation. And then another thing that I do is Tao has for a long time talked about using music in your meditation. And it wasn't until I restarted my piano studies about half a year ago that I really understood it. And what he says and what I do as part of my piano studies, but then it's built into my meditation work as well, is he says to listen to a piece of music every day for 7 days and see if each time you can hear something different. And so when I'm going to perform a piece, I will listen to various interpretations by different artists of the piece that I'm studying. And so what I do now is I listen to the same piece, but it could be by different artists, or perhaps it could be a trio instead of a stringed instruments versus a pianist doing it. So then you can hear the many voices. And then it really teaches you to listen. And so as a good leader, listening is such a critical skill. And so I think that meditating to music and seeing if you can hear the different interpretations, the different voices, for instance, in a trio, it's been really good. And I think that your earlier question about in a crisis, what you do, I have found this past year that when something bad happens, I'm calmer about it because of the meditation work I've done, because of the journaling I've done, because of the gratitude, and the gratitude about really little things. And looking forward, it can also be really little things. And it just shows that every day in life, there's something to be grateful for, something to look forward to in the coming week.
I wholeheartedly agree. And that's such a beautiful way to end. Thank you, Grace. Those are certainly actions that we all can incorporate into our daily lives. So we appreciate you sharing. And thank you for being here with us today and for sharing your wonderful insights. We appreciate it. Greg, I will turn it back over to you just for some final announcements before we depart.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace and Jackie. We so appreciate your time today and spending the hour with our alumni community. So for our viewers, when you close out of the Zoom today, you'll see a brief survey appear on your screen. So please go ahead and fill that out and let us know your thoughts on today's session. And we will be sending out the recording and links after the session today, once those are available. So we so appreciate your time again. Thank you for joining us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.